Let's talk about daughters of narcissistic fathers. I was at a mental health bookstore recently, and there were lots of books there, multiple books actually, not lots, but multiple books about the daughters of narcissistic mothers. There was also a book about the children of emotionally immature parents, and there were multiple memoirs of people written by who had narcissistic parents. But what there was not, interestingly, were books specifically addressing daughters of narcissistic fathers, sons of narcissistic mothers, and sons of narcissistic fathers. That omission wasn't lost on me, and I recognize I am using the gender binary. My hope is that with time, we will have more books and more data that are more encompassing. But these gendered roles do matter because there are societal expectations that go along with them. And so interestingly, as I was in that same bookshop, a woman approached me and said, "Why isn't there anything about daughters of narcissistic fathers?" So to the woman who came up to me and said that, this video is for you. I hope you watch it. Because you're right, there's nothing on it. And I thought about it for a long time after we talked. There's lots on the daughters and mothers. But make no mistake that these other relationships matter, and they matter a lot, maybe just as much. In this video, we're going to focus specifically on the daughters of narcissistic fathers. I think part of the reason that we don't have as many clearly articulated books on any of the children of narcissistic fathers is that it is assumed to be a sort of default that if someone has a narcissistic parent, it is the father or stepfather or some other fathering figure. Well, obviously it's not. And that's because of the gender bias in narcissism. But there's all these books about mothers and daughters, so clearly there's narcissistic mothers. So if a book is about narcissistic parents, maybe the assumption is that it is a father. Again, clearly it's not, but yes, sometimes and quite often it is. But there are unique elements of this dynamic when a daughter is part of the narcissistic relationship. The default assumption that, well, the narcissistic parent is the father may also be related to the different expectations of fathers compared to mothers. Traditionally, mothers have been assumed to be the de facto caregivers. So their behavior was assumed to be more impactful on the child, or whoever the more caregiving figure is, right? And if the mother was narcissistic or abusive, then the assumption is that the shockwaves would be more significantly felt. Well, not so simple. A narcissistic parent affects a child, full stop, regardless of gender. All the usual stuff, the projection of shame, the entitlement, the neglect, the stop-start, on-off cycles, the need for supply, the expectation that the child exists only for the parent's needs, the shaming of the child's needs, that knows no gender, like I said. That's simply what a narcissistic parent does. They gaslight, they manipulate, they withhold, and they withdraw. The child is useful when they are useful, and an inconvenience, or even worse, otherwise. The child is objectified and learns to either play the narcissistic parent's ground game or to rebel so they will be seen, or experience other fallout, including disordered eating, substance use to cope, mood symptoms. Almost all children of narcissistic parents develop significant anxiety, hypervigilance, imposter syndrome. This stuff is universal, regardless of the gender of the parent or child. And yes, a small proportion of children of narcissistic parents go on to become narcissistic themselves, but that is not the norm. But this specific relationship of the daughter of a narcissistic father, what happens here? Now, we have to keep in mind all the other sub-factors, the continuum of severity, and the subtypes of narcissism. The more severe the narcissism, the more maybe even that the father is around or spends time, the greater the impacts. And by around, I don't always mean that the father's physically around. The father may be an in and out, cut bait, and then show up kind of person. By around, what I mean is that whatever that paternal menace, control, manipulation is always there in the background, even if they're out of town, right? Then there are the family roles. If the daughter is the golden child, we may see one set of impacts compared to if the daughter is a scapegoat or in some other family role. So different daughters of one narcissistic father may have very different experiences. If the other parent, usually a mother, is around, that other parent may absorb some of the harm. But then the daughter is given a rather twisted model of what marriage is and how a woman is treated in a marriage or a relationship. If the daughter's parents are divorced, and sometimes she's having to navigate this co-parenting relationship with time, with when there's time that she has to spend with the father without the mother around, it's the usual narcissistic nonsense. And the daughter may be navigating a situation in which the father is speaking badly of the mother. She may witness the father financially abuse the mother even after a divorce or breakup, and the daughter and her siblings may be living in two very different households financially, and there may be guilt about that. Then, adding to the confusion, the father may treat the daughter, especially if she's the golden child, but the father may treat the daughter better than he treats the mother or the other parent. And that can bring up complicated and deeply uncomfortable feelings for the daughter, especially if the daughter feels attached to the mother. She may feel guilty and may even use her so-called power with the narcissistic father to ease things for her mother, which is a very damaging triangulated place for that daughter to be in. Obviously, the more severe the father's narcissism, the more likely you are to see dynamics including verbal aggression, physical aggression, coercive control, financial abuse, isolation. In some cases, you'll see with a narcissistic father very rigid rules and conditional rules that may be applied differently to different children in the household. A narcissistic father, from a probability basis, not always, but the probability is higher, may have more power than the other parent in terms of money, career, social status, which means that even if they are not particularly involved in the household and in the parenting, the narcissistic father can rule by fear, and not just the iron-fisted fear of impending aggression or cruelty, but also the fear of withholding. That the narcissistic father may be quite passive-aggressive and have the whole family jumping to meet their needs, the father's needs, by just going silent. There's a menace to a narcissistic father. Their dark moods may pass over their face, and the whole family, particularly the children, learn to identify it and very quickly become quite aware of it. And this can create a rather messed up model of men and relationships with men for daughters. The expectation becomes that men are to be appeased, praised, tiptoed around, and feared. And trauma responses such as fawning become codified. They just become the only way to be. It can foster a lifelong approach avoidance kind of setup with men for a woman who grows up with a narcissistic father, wanting a relationship but being afraid of one. And not just as partners, but even as friends or colleagues. But obviously, it has its strongest impact when it comes to the relationship between a daughter and a father. And many women will report that after growing up with a narcissistic father, there is this confusing back and forth between wanting closeness with a man, having a fear of men, finding themselves sacrificing themselves fully to have a relationship with a man, wanting to avoid these relationships altogether, or even getting pulled into dynamics such as wanting to be wanted and succumbing more easily to love-bombed or idealized patterns, even while knowing what they are. The narcissistic father, stepfather, any other fathering figure can destroy any healthy template for adult relationships that the daughter is able to develop around men for a long time or even a lifetime. Many survivor daughters of narcissistic fathers have said to me that it was nothing but dumb luck that they ended up with a good man. And in fact, for many years, were often suspicious of their partner's kindness and patience, and sometimes even viewed it as weak until they went through their own therapy and learned not only their good fortune at ending up with this kind man, but also learned that this reciprocal, balanced relationship is what it is supposed to be, and that they could experience that sense of relational safety at an almost embodied level. For many women, they got very confusing communication about who they could be in the world if they had a narcissistic father. Now, many women, not all, but many women are so neglected by a narcissistic father and only either witness the father through the mother's eyes or just grab up the little scraps and bits of attention if and when they come, or they avoid the father altogether because he's scary. And as a result, their identity development completely gets almost annexed or pulled into just trying to win the father over or trying to avoid him. There's that back and forth. And that not only saps the daughter's bandwidth, but any chance of developing into themselves or into what is meaningful to them is sapped because they're just trying to stay safe and connected. And that vigilant, reactive approach to life can dog a woman into adulthood. As I said, the type of narcissism matters. The grandiose narcissistic father can be the shiny, even handsome, attention-seeking father whom the daughter may crave the attention and approval of. And she may also witness that grandiose, charming, charismatic father getting attention from others. Attention from a charming, charismatic father can feel like the sunshine on her face. The grandiose, narcissistic father may not inspire the fear as much as the lack. Because a grandiose, narcissistic parent is only interested in their children in bits and pieces. When they can parade them around, when the kid wants to do what the parent wants them to do. And as a daughter, you may have found that you have taken up whatever interests that your grandiose narcissistic father had just so you could get some time with him and some approval from him. Of all the narcissistic types, the grandiose father would be the most likely to flirt, creating a very messed up template about the sexualization of women. These are fathers who have poor boundaries. They may have affairs in their marriage, which can also create an early narrative that relationships are about betrayal and deceit, and that daughter may also be in the position of having to care for the mother or the other parent who is being hurt by these affairs. However, the vulnerable narcissistic fathers, with their eternal victimhood and the child's need to constantly have to take on their shame that can really do a number on the daughter, the combination of guilt, pity, fear, disappointment, and shame that a vulnerable narcissistic father can raise for a child, not just in childhood, but also in adulthood, can be heavy and really reinforce a trauma bond. In addition, vulnerable narcissistic fathers are the most likely to have failed to launch, which means it may have been a childhood that was a little bit more precarious, maybe even financially, and there was always walking on eggshells so you would not bruise the father's already fragile ego. This almost trains the daughter to become a lifelong appeaser in all of her relationships. Communal narcissistic fathers are those dads who come off as the pillar of the community, that help the neighbor out father, the father who donates money to whatever causes, the local politician, the local business leader. But the daughter may have to reconcile this sort of beloved, idealized version of the father that the public sees with the often demanding, cruel, invalidating, or negating father at home. And there can be a real pull to be what this father wants since he is so publicly valued. And even the other parent, typically the mother, if she doesn't fully see how toxic this dynamic is, may also be caught up in the cult of the communal father. And this can mess up the daughter's discernment as she goes into adulthood as she may not be able to connect the dots on this, and even in adulthood be very confused about how to read the signs on relationships that are not fully psychologically safe, especially if the person has some sort of like rescuer persona in the world. Now, daughters of narcissistic fathers often get caught up in an impossible space of wanting to succeed to prove themselves to their father or even be noticed by them, but also feeling anxious, vigilant, doubting themselves, or feeling like an imposter, which leads these daughters to hold themselves back, feeling guilty, ashamed for disliking their father, but locked into a trauma-bonded cycle of wanting to prove something to the father, being perfectionistic, wanting to be everything that father wants, and also lacking some essential templates and models of what healthy adult relationships look like, especially with men, and may find, these daughters of narcissistic fathers may find that they've had cycles of unavailable partners, emotionally abusive partners, partners that require appeasing, as though it is a working through to prove themselves to the partners or bosses that they end up with. Obviously, the personality of the other parent matters, and some daughters of narcissistic fathers who have healthy relationships with a mother or other parenting figure find that healthy attachment is very important as part of their healing. Heaven help those whose other parent is also narcissistic or somehow not attuned. That is beyond what I can get into here, because that's really where the wheels fall off. And in many cases, there is a sense of fear and loathing and anger and trauma bonding with the narcissistic father, while simultaneously feeling a sense of being abandoned by the other parent, who may not have been toxic or unhealthy per se, but rather may have been so focused on doing the impossible balancing act of trying to make the marriage or the relationship work, that they were not attuned to their children. The entire family system becomes the "let's please dad" show. In adulthood, these daughter-father relationships can be fraught. Again, a sort of an approach and then an avoidance. Although some daughters will go no contact, especially if the parents were divorced. Others will say they feel sort of pity or guilty about the father, who, if that father does not find a new partner in adulthood, they feel that that narcissistic father has lost their power in the world, and now the daughter feels obligated to step in and care for him. And if the parents never divorce, and the daughters continue to witness the toxic dance between the parents, especially if that daughter is trying to protect the non-narcissistic parent who had to remain in the relationship for whatever reason they did, it can be a lifelong sense of grief at having to continue to engage with this toxic dynamic and the accumulated toll on the daughter's health of having to manage it, especially if most other people walked away from this toxic marriage. And a sideline issue is the narcissistic stepfather issue. Now, this stepfather could be someone who is around since your early childhood, and so feels like a fathering figure, or someone who comes around afterwards. And it is an absolutely terrible story when a narcissistic stepfather comes in after you have already endured and continue to endure a narcissistic biological father or initial father. The narcissistic father will have no problem sweeping in, acting like the new emperor, enacting their rules, overwhelming the existing relationships within the system, and then you might then have to watch as the daughter, watching your protective parent getting pulled into the toxic system of the step-parent and leaving children feeling completely alone. While the potency of this dynamic will vary depending on the age at which the stepfather comes into the picture, the existing relationship with the original father and the severity and type of narcissism of the stepfather, the reactions a daughter has to a stepfather may still represent any form of trauma bonding, or may also be a self-silencing coupled with a sense of abandonment by the parent who has brought this harmful step-parent into the family. And then there's culture. Culture is a lot when we're talking about parental relationships. And in some cultures in which daughters are differentially and often less valued than male children, the relationship with the father may be one of control, diminishment, and being viewed through what I can only call a subjugated lens of limited opportunity. That as a daughter, all you're really expected to do is get married, have kids, and keep your mouth shut. And if the daughter outshines a male child in one of these systems, it can get ugly. Or the daughter may even be sabotaged, or the family may withdraw from her as punishment for her success or independence. The sons in these systems get a free pass and are pretty much born as golden children. And systems such as honor and hierarchies and general societal devaluation of women can take the narcissistic dynamic and magnify it. The more collective the culture and the system, the more likely the family will rally around and enable and embolden the father's toxic behavior. Daughters of narcissistic fathers in these types of cultural systems may find that they either have to give in and capitulate and sacrifice their true selves or rebel, which in some cases can be downright dangerous. But the only way to live life that is accessible to them as their true selves, and it carries massive risks. Make no mistake, daughters are significantly shaped by their fathers in unique ways that relate to psychological safety, attunement, schemas and roadmaps for adult relationships, power, sense of self, and it is subtle and influenced by numerous other dynamics like severity, type of narcissism, and the role of adults and other family members, other families like siblings, and culture. Ultimately, a narcissistic father will definitely take a toll on a daughter, and this will be a lifelong toll that can even persist after the death of that father. The usual rules, radical acceptance, grief, disengagement, support, therapy all apply. But for most daughters, these schemas and templates and responses become the emotional DNA and take a long time to work through. It can be done, but the outcome, having to detach and disconnect or endure the lifelong invalidation, can be an eternal burden that daughters either have to learn to navigate or spend a lifetime healing from. Thanks again.